This program is underwritten by...
Support comes from Seaflight with a fleet of Cessna 208 amphibious aircraft with AC and leather seating. Seaflight provides a complete range of aviation services, 6 round-trip flights from St. Thomas to St. Croix, and charters to all Caribbean islands. For more information, 340-714-3000. Seaflight, in operation since 2007.
Viewers like you. The views expressed on this program are not necessarily those of WTJX, its board, staff, or underwriters.
The League of Women Voters of the Virgin Islands is pleased to present this special forum as an opportunity for us all to learn more about the reapportionment initiative that is scheduled for a vote in the special election on March 30th. This educational forum is in keeping with the history and mission of the League of Women Voters organization. I am Dr. Gwen Marie Molinar, a past president of the local chapter of the League of Women Voters and chair of our local Voter Service Committee. And with me as co-moderator is...
Laverne Raxter, also a past president of the League of Women Voters. As many of you in the public are already aware, the League of Women Voters as an organization is nonpartisan in that it does not support nor oppose candidates for political office nor political parties. It does encourage and does work to increase understanding of major public policy issues, as we believe that democracy is best supported by informed and active citizens.
With that as our mission, we, a local chapter of the League, believe that the reapportionment initiative is of special significance for us as Virgin Islanders, and we want to thank WTJX, the program sponsor, and especially all the participants in this educational forum for the opportunity to have this event.
We need to say upfront that the League of Women Voters of the Virgin Islands neither supports nor opposes the initiative, but seeks to increase public understanding of the initiative in preparation for the special vote on March 30th. We have assembled what we believe is a well-balanced group of intelligent and articulate persons for this forum. We will begin with some formal presentations, followed by a discussion of the presentations. We trust that you will find the next 2 hours not only informative and engaging, but thought-provoking, and that it will assist you in making an informed decision in preparation for your vote on March 30th.
Our formal presentations will begin with Senator Myron Jackson, who will present a brief summary of the history of apportionment and legislative structure in the territory, as it is important for us to know what has been and what is in order to best determine how, why, and where to move forward. Because of his schedule, Senator Jackson can't be with us in person, but he was kind enough to tape his presentation.
Greetings. This is Senator Myron D. Jackson, the chairman of the Committee on Culture and Planning. I have the pleasure of providing you the historic overview of the formation and establishment of the Virgin Islands Legislature. The beginning of the legislature can be traced back to the passage of the colonial laws of 1852. This law was the first constitution of the islands under Danish rule. It provided for the establishment of a unified colonial assembly and for a governor as the chief executive who served as the regent of the King of Denmark. He had the power to dissolve the assembly under the provisions of the law. The colonial assembly, which served all 3 islands, was basically limited to an advisory role. It could make recommendations which could be accepted or rejected by the governor, and the king still reserved the final authority to reject or amend any law in the colony. The Colonial Assembly was forced to attempt to combine two incompatible economic systems into one political system. St. Thomas was a maritime economy and St. Croix an agrarian economy. St. Croix had a larger delegation to the Assembly than the other two islands. That created conflicts as it related to recommendations that were passed that was unfavorable to St. Thomas and St. John. Due to transportation challenges, indifferences, and hostilities, St. Thomas delegates ceased to attend meetings, and none were conducted between 1856 and 1859. The legislative system fell apart 11 years after its inception and was suspended by the colonial law of 1863. The law denied participation of the masses of our native Virgin Islanders, and only landowners and people of means in the society, 5.5% of the population, was able to vote and had no voice whatsoever in the running of their government. The colonial law of 1906 amended the 1863 law and was the last constitutional document handed down by the Danish government and reflected their position that although natives should be free to express their opinion, that decision-making function must rest with the mother country. And Virgin Islanders had little self-government. As a result of the sale and transfer of the islands to the United States in 1917, Virgin Islanders assumed that it came with American citizenship and that they would also receive a greater measure of self-government. We got neither. The important question which the United States had to resolve was whether it could assume the entire responsibility for the economic and social welfare of its new possessions by maintaining the political status quo, or whether it should encourage democratic institutions to enable the people to participate in their own development. By Act of Congress of the United States, passed on March 3, 1917, a provision was made for the government of the Virgin Islands. Basically, the system of the colonial government introduced by Denmark through the colonial law of 1906 was retained. Executive power was vested in the President of the United States, but he could delegate his power to a governor and such person or persons whom he might appoint. No executive order was ever issued covering the relationship of the Navy Department to the government of the Virgin Islands. In May of 1925, a political crisis developed on St. Croix when the governor dissolved the Colonial Council. And a year elapsed before the council would meet again to transact business. Virgin Islanders demanded the replacement of the Navy administration by a civilian administration and for the fulfillment of the 1917 promise for a more permanent system. Between 1924 and 1927, several proposed bills for the constitutional reform were discussed by congressional committees on insular affairs, and none were adopted due to the lack of consensus in Congress and the United States' racial attitudes towards people of color and native peoples of the U.S. territories. Agitation by political activists such as Rachel Francis and D. Hamilton Jackson and countless others for self-government and racial equality is noted at home and abroad. In 1927, U.S. citizenship is granted by executive order of President Herbert Hoover to native Virgin Islanders with the help of the American Civil Liberties Union. The order provided for the transfer of the administration of the islands from the Navy Department to the Department of Interior. In June 22, 1936, the United States Congress passed the Organic Act of 1936. Under this provision of this act, a system of civil government was achieved. 2 colonial councils, now municipal councils, with the exclusion of their appointment, shall combine to form a legislative assembly. They were given legislative powers to pass laws and to override the governor's veto by 2/3 vote. Although in this event, final veto power went to the President of the United States. The Legislative Assembly, which could convene upon the passage of resolutions by both councils or on the call of the governor, had the authority to enact legislation for the entire Virgin Islands. To be eligible for membership in the municipal council, a candidate had to be at least 25 years of age, a qualified voter in the municipality in which he sought election, and be a resident of that municipality for no less than 3 years preceding the date of election. The Organic Act of 1936 was a major sign of victory for native Virgin Islanders who wanted a greater measure of self-government. Of this act, the greatest features included the granting of universal suffrage and a permanent removal of property and income qualifications for voting. This took political control of the islands from the upper class and the landed gentry and placed it squarely in the hands of thousands of working and lower class citizens of the Virgin Islands. Thus, the face of the legislative branch was also changed. Conservative legislators preferring the status quo were replaced by more liberal, sometimes even radical ones, who were more dedicated to bringing about social and economic changes, better working conditions for the working man and woman, the grassroots of the Virgin Islands. Despite apparent victories, however, there were still items left to be desired in the new governmental system. Although councils were empowered to enact legislation and override the governor's veto, the Congress of the United States still reserved the power to annul any and all legislation enacted by the Virgin Islands government. The President of the United States retained final veto power in the case of a legislative override of the governor's veto. In addition, the Legislative Assembly, the body that passed laws for the entire territory, was the representative of unified government. It did not meet with frequency that would have been desirable and was only empowered to act on bills proposed by the governor or by both the separate councils. In other words, the Legislative Assembly was not capable of independent action. It can be said, therefore, that there was still no viable working instrument to enact legislation for the entire Virgin Islands, and that a unified system of government was still woefully lacking. By this point, it was more than high time that one was put into effect. In 1954, this unified legislative system was put into effect with the United States Congress passed the Revised Organic Act of 1954. Among other things, this act created a unicameral body called the Legislature of the Virgin Islands, in which all legislative powers were vested. For the first time since 1863, the government of the Virgin Islands was fused into one entity. A relatively equal balance of power between executive and legislative branches was finally obtained. In addition, equal representation from St. Thomas and St. Croix was achieved. The legislature, created by the Revised Organic Act, was unicameral and consisted of 11 members, 3 from the District of St. Croix, 3 from the District of St. Thomas, 1 from the District of St. John, and 4 at-large serving all 3 islands. The at-large concept is usually utilized solely for the purpose of embodying the unified interests and to reduce inter-island deadlocks. In 1966, the legislature underwent further change when the United States Congress and Virgin Islands legislature passed a resolution. The number of seats were increased from 11 to 15, and the distribution changed to the following: 7 from the District of St. Thomas, St. John, 7 from the District of St. Croix, and 1 at large who must be a resident of St. John. This is the structure of the legislature of the Virgin Islands in its present form. The unicameral body has the legislative rights and powers enjoyed by most states and territories. The struggle for self-government continues after 102 years under the United States flag.
We thank Senator Jackson for his summary. We know that it was tough to condense our very rich history in the time given, but we thank him for having done it and done it so well. With that as a background, let's now move forward in our formal presentations. And we will now hear from the Chief Architect and spokesperson for the Reapportionment Initiative, Mr. Mario Moorhead. Mr. Moorhead, could you please explain what is being proposed, its goals, how it changes what we currently have, and why it is being proposed as a better alternative to what we currently have? And you have 15 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Moorhead.
Thank you. The St. Croix government retirees have accomplished an unprecedented milestone. It's not acknowledged, but then again, the cloak of ignorance that covers the Virgin Islands continues to keep us befuddled as to what kind of government we do have. We were given a Republican form of government by the Congress of the United States with the 1954 Revised Organic Act that to this day stands as our Constitution. Most unfortunately, the St. Croix government retirees does not get the celebratory commendations that it deserves for bringing this initiative to the point where in 5 weeks we will be having a special election for the voters of the Virgin Islands to determine the structure our legislature should be governed by. I dare say that we have had a minimum of exposure to what our government is and what the structure should be. Within the last few days, I was stunned when I was advised that our honorable delegate to Congress said she was opposed to the reapportionment of the legislature to the Republican form of government that she is a delegate to. It is amazing that we do not have an understanding of our structure of government. Yet, politicians and the politically connected continue to spew specious information for public consumption. We have heard everything from numbered seats to the desires of each and every one as to what they would like to see as the makeup of the legislature of the Virgin Islands. Neither politicians or the politically connected will take the time to explain that the Constitution of the United States, the revised Organic Act of the Virgin Islands, they specify the government that the Virgin Islands should have. They particularly describe the structure of the government. 3 separate branches of government, separate but co-equal, checking and balancing each other. As James Madison, the architect of the United States Constitution, as he pointed out in the Federalist Papers, if I'm not mistaken, it would be Federalist Paper number 51. Ambition must be counterbalanced by ambition. Checks and balances are essential to the running of government, not simply to the 3 branches checking and balancing each other, but the first branch of government, the predominant power of government, must be checked and balanced. The Congress of the United States does it by way of a bicameral legislature called the Congress of the United States. The upper house, the U.S. Senate, is elected geographically. 2 senators to every state, regardless of the size of the state. The lower house, the House of Representatives, is elected by the population. This being the essential check and balance of the Republican form of government. A geographically elected upper house checking and balancing a population elected lower house. The Congress of the United States was able to create this check and balance governmental structure in a unicameral body by creating at-large and district senators. The at-large senators mimicking the function of the United States Senate, the upper house. The district senators mimicking the function of the lower house of Congress, the House of Representatives. It was a check and balance legislature that we inherited with the November 1954 election for our first legislature. By 1966, whether it is the continued ignorance or political malfeasance that brought about the system that we have been struggling to survive with for the past 53 years. We had 3 districts with 7 district senators and 4 at-large senators, given the authority to reapportion the legislature in 1966. Check and balance went bush. The Republican form of government is yet to be rediscovered. The Congress authorized reapportionment because of the explosive growth of the Virgin Islands in the 1960s. From 1960 to 1970, the population of the Virgin Islands doubled. The Congress gave authority to increase the size of the body from 11 to 15 members. We don't get the kind of discussion. We don't have civic in our schools, so we're left to just speculate as to why, in view of the population growth, the legislature was reapportioned from 3 districts to 2, while the membership was increased from 11 to 15. But then again, struggling to survive under this cloak of ignorance, we fail to realize that it was the voting public, the electorate, that suffered a defeat. And politicians gained the freedom of being unchecked, unbalanced, running like a wild horse through the cassia, with no bit in the mouth, no harness on his head, no reins on the voters who are supposed to be controlling their representatives. Not only does the honorable delegate to the Congress oppose the reimposition of check and balance in a Republican form of government, to which she's a delegate, but we have very well-prepared and informed people, like a certified election representation administrator who is with us, Mr. John Abramson. Unfortunately, the system that we are trying to adjust to on this program does not allow for Mr. Abramson to be an interlocutor with the St. Croix government retirees, so that we don't get the opportunity to ask, why does our next door neighbor to the west, why does Puerto Rico have 40 districts and St. Croix reduced to 2? What about our British sisters to the east? Half the size of these Virgin Islands of ours. Not even half the size. Yet, they can boast of 9 districts with 4 at-large senators. Check and balance. And they don't have to conform to the Republican form of government. They pattern themselves off the Westminster system. Yet here we are, not illuminating the reality of our political status as an unincorporated territory of the Virgin Islands of the United States by illuminating the electorate as to how government functions and how significant the structure of the lawmaking body, the first branch, how significant it is to the representation that the voters get. But that opportunity will have to wait for another time. But we hope that the former supervisor of election, Mr. John Abrahamson, will be so kind as to address some of these matters. If I might, Saturday, March 2nd, from 5 to 8 p.m., the St. Croix government retirees will hold a forum at the St. Croix Education and Complex Auditorium. Then on Sunday, March 10th, from 3 to 6 p.m. in St. Thomas at the Ivana Ken Cafeteria. We hope we'll be able to benefit from politicians and the politically connected to explain this initiative. Thank you much.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Moorhead, for your presentation. We'll have time for a full discussion of your presentation soon with our discussants. But let us first hear from our next formal presenter, Dr. Adam Parr, who is a math professor at the University of the Virgin Islands, for his views on the electoral process. Dr. Parr, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for having me here today. It's a pleasure. I've been asked here to talk about some of the electoral issues that are involved with this proposal. And first, I'd like to note that it's a little bit difficult to do so for a couple of reasons. One of which is that there's a lot of key details that are left out of the initiative that will need to be addressed afterwards. And the other one is the stated objectives for the nature of the objectives for the proposal. Normally in this situation, I would look at the objectives trying to be obtained, trying to see if the changes were going to achieve that objectives and maybe any unintended effects. But in this case, thank you very much. So in this case, the stated objectives for the measure and are not electoral in nature, and there's a couple of things left out, which is what are the voting methods that will be used and how are these districts to be drawn. There's always some really good reasons to change electoral methods because no method is perfect. And the normal reasons for changing would be to try to find a method that better represents the will of the electorate. And that's almost always what people are arguing about. How do you even determine that? For example, there's a movement right now to abolish the Electoral College. The stated reason for that is that the method can provide a result wherein the winner actually receives fewer votes than one of the losing candidates. Some lesser reasons is you might address changes to the governmental structure, but usually you decide the governmental structure first and then you decide the electoral method after that. There can also be some logistics and efficiency issues as well. The stated reasons for this proposed electoral change really are to change the structure of the government by making changes to the electoral method. It's not a real standard way to go. So with all of that said, what that's meant is that I've had to look at this in a very general manner, not very specifically, and that's what I'm going to do now. First, what are the current and proposed systems? Right now we have one territorial at-large district and it's elected by plurality. We also have two multi-member districts, both with 7 legislators, and the voting method used there is a block voting method. The proposed system is looking at having 2 multi-member at-large territorial voting areas, but there has been no voting method specified. And having 4 multi-member districts, each with 2 members, and again, the voting method has been left unspecified. And then there is a 1-member district, and I would assume that that voting method is probably going to be plurality because that's the most important one. The couple of things I'd like to note is that changing the voting method can actually have a much larger effect than redistricting in many situations if you're looking for that. And also how to draw the districts. Now, to explain our block voting method and why it might have some troubles, our block voting method, instead of having 1 voter per vote, every voter gets to cast 1 vote per number of seats in the district. So we get to cast 7 votes for our legislators in our districts currently, but you only get to apply 1 vote to each candidate. There are some issues with this. The biggest one is majority rule. You can have a very small majority, 50% plus 1, which can decide all of the legislators, choose all of the seats, and even if your majority is not so big, you can still dominate the election. Also, it may be in the voters' best interest not to use all of their votes. This voting method has actually been declared a violation of the Voting Rights Act in some jurisdictions in the U.S. South because of this majority rule issue. And there are some modified versions of this method that can be used in multi-member districts that can change that effect. So in our current system, we have a couple of the electoral issues. We do have these multi-member districts, which we also are going to have in these proposed systems. They are a problem. The current system utilizes that block voting method, and there's 1 constituency which chooses a full 7 legislators, 7 representatives. With the proposed system, we'll still have the multi-member districts. The voting methods, though, we have no idea what those are going to really be. The district boundaries, we're not sure how those are going to be drawn, but one thing that it does do is it breaks up the constituency. So rather than having a single constituency choosing all 7 voters, then you're going to have multiple constituencies, all 7 representatives. You're going to have multiple constituencies choosing the different representatives. That's a pretty big change. Some of the logistical issues with each system. The current system actually, the current system is flows pretty well. It's pretty easy to manage. With the new system, it's not so sure how easy that's going to be because we're going to have to figure out districts and assign people to those districts and the like, but probably not terribly unmanageable. As far as proportionality is concerned, our current system actually puts equal strength to every voter in the entire district, and they handle very small St. John in a rather interesting and good way by having the 1 at-large senator. With the proposed system, there is a proportionality issue because the St. John voters will be voting for slightly fewer representatives, 7 rather than 8, but they will have significantly more voting power than the other voters. As far as proportionality, how many districts would we need in order to give St. John a single district? Probably around 21, depending on the census numbers that we're using. And that's a lot larger than most people in the Virgin Islands have said that they want the legislature to be. So what would I give as far as recommendations? The first thing I would say is that any debate or discussion to change the government, which I know is going to go on here, any debate to change the governmental structure really ought to be done prior to deciding upon the electoral system. Once that is decided, though, eliminate as many of the multi-member districts as you can. Single districts with the plurality method are usually the best way to go, but that can be debated as well. If there is only one representative in each district, then you either have to have a lot of representatives, 21 or more, 25 maybe even, or you include St. John as part of another district. And that would be my conclusion there.
Well, thank you so very much, Dr. Power. And you finished just in time. We'll have some questions for you during the discussion phase. And we next come to our next formal presenter, and Ms. Carolyn Fawkes, who is our current Supervisor of Elections. Thank you, Ms. Fawkes, for being here. Would you like to begin with some opening remarks?
Again, it's a pleasure to be here. The election system of the Virgin Islands plays two roles in this process. First, we're involved with a titling board, and that was initiated by the Office of the Supervisor, coordinates with the AG office and the legal counsel of the legislature. So that was the first process, and that's handled by the Office of the Supervisor. And after the second process, is the election process where we are today. Again, we are beginning that process. We're very much on our way. We have already put out the sample ballots. We have already put out the calendar. It's available on our website, www.vivote.gov. And our main role is to encourage the voters to come out and vote. The legislature have given us a budget to conduct the election process. Whether we have one voter or 27,000 voters, we have to go through the same process for an election. So we're just encouraging the voters to come out and vote your desired wishes. And I'm available for any questions that you may have.
Well, great. I'm glad. I know that you have to leave, so let me ask my questions first. I'd like you to clarify for the listening public and clear up an issue that has been offered some confusion in the public. If you listen to some voters speaking, they have interpreted the percentage of people who have to vote to pass this. Some have been saying it is 50% plus 1%. Others have saying it's 50% plus 1. What actually is stated in the law?
The law says 50% plus 1 is not 51%.
Exactly.
50% of the number, and I use this example, as of yesterday, we had 51,682 voters. 50% of that number is 25,841. And you add 1 to that, required 25,842 to participate, and the majority of that number voting yes will support the initiative. Majority of that number voting no, then the initiative will fail. So it's 50% plus 1. The code is very clear. If it wanted to be 1%, it would have said 50% plus 1%.
Exactly, which would be 51%. Exactly. I'm so happy that you have made that clarification for the public. Now, what has been the local success of having at least 50% of our registered voters participate in any election?
I would say our local success over the years have been great compared to the national level over the last 10 years. The Virgin Islands has always averaged an above 40% turnout. Again, in the years that we had more than 50%, I've looked at some historical data, and I'm usually comparing general elections. So I'll start with the 2018, the last one that we had. Combined, it was 52%, because again, it was the two districts thing. 2016, St. Croix had 45%, St. Thomas had 46%. 2014, St. Croix had 58%, St. Thomas had 51%. 2012, St. Croix had 69%, St. Thomas had 55%. 2010, St. Croix had 64%, St. Thomas had 69%. So out of those 10 years that I had, 5 times, 3 out of the 5 years had over 50%, which is 60% of that number. So that's what we had there.
Great. So it is achievable. Now, of course, these were, as you just pointed out, as part of the general election.
That's correct.
And so this, of course, will be a special election. We've had special elections in the past. What has that been like for us in terms of turnout in the past and special elections?
Okay, special elections starting currently going back again. 2017, we had a special election that was St. Thomas, St. John district only for the legislature, and that was 19% turnout. 1993, we had a referendum on political status. That was 53% turnout St. Thomas, St. John, 46% turnout in St. Croix. 1992, we had a referendum on casino gambling, 54% turnout, 46% in the St. Croix district. 1990, referendum on local government, we had 53% turnout, 46% in the St. Croix district. 1989, we had a special election, St. Croix district only, we had a 25% turnout. 1981, referendum on the Constitutional Convention, 52% turnout St. Thomas St. John, 48% turnout in St. Croix.
Ms. Fox, could you just, if I may I ask?
Yes, yes,
please,
of course, yeah.
When you determine whether or not you've made the quota, are you talking about the territory or per district?
When I did the ones in the top, there was per district.
Right.
And again, here I'm doing per
You
district.
just
Yeah.
okay. So, but when you decide if you have met a threshold for being able to be a valid activity, valid electoral process, you're talking about the territory, not so it would have to be those both districts combined, yes?
Well, in the 2018, I did combine, and it was 52%.
Okay. Just
But
wanna
I didn't
make sure
combine
that
down here because I
that's
wanted to
clear.
sure. But if you combine these, if you already have over 53% and 48, 46, I'm sure you get close to 51%.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
So
I
it would
just
be-
want that
Right,
to be clear. No,
right.
Thank you.
We
So it
could
would be the
combine
average, of course.
average
Yes.
of both,
Yeah.
correct.
Yeah.
And so, like I said, the last one, we had 1978, the referendum on capital punishment. The percentage overall was 51% because we only had 1% there. So 50% or more is achievable.
Okay, so we have done it in the past. Now, this depends on us having a voting roster that we can be sure is accurate. How confident are you that we do have a roster that is accurate?
Our roster is accurate. Again, voters relocating is not a new phenomenon. That happens all year long. Based on the database that we have, we had a general election, like I said, and runoff in November. We are now in March. We see the number of additional voters that have added to our rolls, but our voter registration is accurate. There's processes that we utilize. The Department of Health sends us quarterly listing of all the deaths, and we delete them from our list. We also get listing from the court, and anyone that commit a felony, there's a process that we suspend them, and if they meet all the requirements and they become returned to be an eligible voter, we reinstitute them. So there are processes in place for all our voters.
Okay, one final question as our time is running out. There'll be a census next year, 2020. Why not wait until then when we will have an accurate count of voter lists?
Again, here we are today conducting a special election in March. So I would recommend that we move forward instead of waiting until 2020. It'll take us 2020 to get to the process that we need for that election, so we need to prepare now. So I always said, do what you can today and not leave it till tomorrow.
Thank you, Ms. Fawkes, for your insights, ideas, and information. Now, with these presentations as a backdrop, let us discuss what we've heard. And Dr. Raxter, you lead that discussion.
We are delighted to have 3 articulate members of the community to add to the discussions and the presentations that you've just heard. First, we have Mr. Gerard Emanuel, Ms. Irva Denham, and Mr. John Abramson, all persons that have been working in our community. Thank you for consenting to be here. Our discussion will proceed around key ideas of the presentations we just heard. Questions will be posed to lead the discussion and should be no longer than 1 minute long. And the responses to the questions we're trying to keep within 3 minutes. We will see how that goes. The League planned this discussion format to be one in which a group of intelligent adult members of the community can discuss their understanding and concerns or support for the initiative in a way that would be informative to the community. Let's begin. I'd like to start by asking the first question, and by the way, we will have questions asked by myself as well as members of the panel, and our panel now will have 5 people on it. So you'll again hear from Mr. Moorhead and Dr. Parr as appropriate as they have questions or comments to make. But we're hoping to have Ms. Denham, Mr. Abramson, and Mr. Emanuel lead with many of these questions. So Mr. Emanuel, we've been speaking about words that people who text don't have a lot on their phones. Reapportionment, redistricting, initiative. Please define those, even though we've been talking about it earlier.
Reapportionment is very simple. It just means changing the structure of a legislative body. Redistricting means determining the size of and the number of areas that voters reside and will be casting ballots from. And what was the third one?
Initiative. What is an initiative?
An initiative is just a way that people can create and pass legislation.
Okay. Anybody wants to add to those definitions?
Well, I would like to.
Yes, Mr. Abramson.
First of all, I wanted, before I preface all my statements, once again, I want to congratulate the St. Croix Retirees Group for their historical achievement in terms of meeting the initiative. I've said this many times in many radio programs. Have been the former supervisor. I've presided over 5 attempts, and I'm enthused, and I want to make it clear that I congratulate them unequivocally for what they've done. First of all, the word reapportionment you asked for means simply number of seats. That's what it means, number of seats. Redistricting means lines drawn. I'm trying to make this as simple as possible. An initiative means an action of and by the people. Very simple.
Okay. Does anyone want to add any comments, any changes to that particular definition or add to any of the others? Okay, and I'm seeing Mr. Moorhead wants to respond.
Very simply, if I might, there's no concept of redistricting. We're simply talking about either adding or subtracting districts. We are not redistricting from a larger district to smaller districts.
Okay, Mr. Moorhead, you're speaking about it with respect to the initiative that's going to come forward. You're saying that it is not a redistricting effort. That's the point you're making.
That's the point.
Okay, I just want to make sure that that's clear. Thank you. I didn't mean to confuse people by saying that that's what was said, but those terms have been used in discussions in the community. I wanted to make sure people understood. So one of the questions that I would like to ask, and I think I'm going to ask Ms. Denham to start for me on this one. We have a number of issues that come up about these the senators that we'll be talking about in terms of being at large or district oriented. What about residency requirements for the candidates? That was one of the questions that seems to come up. Do you have a way of handling this?
It's a question. Thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting me to be on the program. And thank you, Mr. Moorhead, for your incredible efforts, for the effort of the St. Croix retirees. It is truly remarkable that an initiative under the burden that we are under to get one this far, that it has been achieved, is incredible. But I had a question regarding the initiative question that I'm hoping you can answer, and that is, why is it that there is no residency requirement on the proposed initiative for district senators? There is one for at-large senators, but it doesn't so state for district senators. That leads me to believe that, well, perhaps someone from, let's say, Hans Bluff could end up representing St. John. Is this something that just needs to be worked out later, or was it an oversight? It's clear who's to vote, but it's not clear who can run for what particular area.
Mr. Moorhead, can you clarify that?
I do my best. The titling board wanted to be as simple and cogent as possible, so that it was our understanding that what is not included in the language of the initiative is left to the election system, so that they would be the ones to decide what would constitute a bona fide resident of a district.
Well, once again, that's a resident, but who may be a senator in that district? According to this, St. Croix will get 3 at-large senators, and they must be residents of St. Croix. St. Thomas will get 3. They must reside in St. Croix, but the language doesn't say that a district senator must reside in that district. Is that going to be changed, do you think, or was that set up that way on purpose?
That was purposely done by the titling board, and I certainly wish that the supervisor of election was still here, that she could respond to that. It's a 3-member board: the Attorney General, the Chief Legal Counsel of the Legislature, and the Supervisor of Elections. And we did our best to reduce the language to its bare bones. And so it is for the election system to make the division from 2 districts to 5. Similarly, the qualifications for candidacy at the district level.
Okay. Anybody wants to respond to that? I need to say it. Yes, Mr. Abramson?
Again, I must say that by statute, the election system is not entitled nor authorized, unless there's some special legislation, for them to make this action. This is a legislative activity that must take place. And these concerns, these questions are the type of issues that I believe we must get the public to start to think about. These concerns are critical. We understand what has been proposed, but we have, at least I do, the questions that, the things that are not said are really the eating is in the pudding, the things that are not said, because that's what makes us understand whether this is good for us or bad.
Okay. Yes. I have a question I'm going to ask. I think I'm going to start with Ms. Denham, and then I'm going to ask Mr. Emmanuel to respond to the same question. What do you see as the functional differences between district and at-large senators under the new system?
You wanted me to respond
Yes,
to that
please.
one? Well, it seems to me that they would be pretty much as they are now. If you're a district senator, you should be representing the district which elected you. The at-large senator, will, although we only have one, is basically responsible for the Virgin Islands as a whole. By having more at-large senators, perhaps we have a bigger voice for the larger issue. Together, they still have to they still have to come to agreement, though. They're still going to be having to work with the same kind of majorities to come to agreement on whatever issues they do act on. But with this, I think that at the district level, there might be a chance for people from the district to have a little bit more say about what goes on within the legislature. But there are other ways that that could be handled as well.
That question, Mr. I'm going to ask Mr. Emmanuel this. Based on what Ms. Denham just said, why would, under the new system, somebody have more say from the district representatives?
I don't know if they would have more say, and thank you for the question. But I know you should be able to hold your representative accountable, because that representative is now focused on a very small area. That person can't hide and say, well, you could ask 6 other persons. I didn't have time to deal with that. They would have to address the concerns of that specific district only, that district senator. Okay, they don't have to worry about the rest of St. Thomas or the rest of St. Croix.
So no. That is the way you see the difference between district and the person that's at large. So they only respond to the things happening in their area. That's all they care about.
No, I'm saying that that's what they're going to be held accountable to. They still have to vote on issues concerning
Correct.
the territory.
Yes.
But your original question was the difference between at-large and district.
Correct.
One checks the other. The
Please
district...
help me to understand that. What do you mean by one checks the other?
Okay.
Because Mr. Moorhead brought some of this up in terms of the check and balance. Please give a little bit more understanding to that.
Just like the Congress of the United States has 2 houses. The popular house is the House of Representatives. The more aristocratic house that has members serving for 6 years, they have to check what happens in the House. Also in the Senate, they're the ones that approve nominations for the Supreme Court and things like that. The House of Representatives doesn't. But in the Virgin Islands, we don't have that same thing. What will happen is this. The at-large senators can't hide and say, well, I'm not from St. Croix, so I don't have to worry about St. Croix. they have to be concerned about the entire territory. Okay, right now the way it's set up with just 7 district senators and 1 at large. If a senator from one district doesn't want something, but the people in his district want it, he could get somebody from the other district to vote for it. And he could vote another way and say, well, see, I tried to help you, but you know, my colleagues in the other district didn't vote for it. When you have 6 at-large senators, it reduces the possibility of that happening. We just have 1 at-large senator now, so it doesn't really make a difference. So anyhow, what I'm saying is that the at-large senators have to be concerned about the entire territory because they're elected from the entire territory. A district senator only has to be concerned about his or her particular district.
Okay, I see. Let me ask Mr. Abramson and then Mr. Moorhead to weigh in on this because I have questions as well.
As you know, we still have a unicameral legislature.
Correct.
District senators are still going to vote on territorial issues. At-large senators will still vote on district issue. We have no change. The matter is basically the same. We are still going to have 15 senators. They're still going to be in a unicameral legislature. I understand the conceptual idea. If we were moving to a bicameral legislature where we had a House and a Senate, then the conceptual idea that the proponents are giving us would be reasonable. But in my mind, I see us having exactly the same issues. And the change, in my mind, is basically to the candidates. It costs at least $100,000 or somewhere there close to, maybe $80,000, $85,000 to run a district campaign. We are now talking, if you run a territorial campaign, you can ask anybody that has done this, it's about $300,000. So for the candidates, it becomes an exorbitant cost. Where is this money going to start to come from? Often we hear the term corruption, and smaller numbers in terms of district senators are easily corrupted. These kind of conceptual ideas need to be brought into the discussion because, in truth, nothing changes. We still have the same governmental structure. We might move people around on the chessboard, but in terms of voting, they're going to be doing it the exact same way.
Okay, Mr. Moorhead, you wanted to respond to this as well?
Very, very pointedly. This is constitutional. Okay. A reading of the Constitution of the United States will tell you that district senators are representing the population. At-large senators represent a geographical area, a location. This is constitutional. Please, the revised Organic Act, the Congress gave us a check and balance legislature. 4 at-large senators with 7 district senators. It's constitutional. It's simply that we don't have civic courses, so we don't get exposed to this. But it's written right there in the Constitution.
So, Mr. Moorhead, if I'm understanding you correctly, it's still a unicameral body.
Yes.
And you have at-large and district senators functioning in there, and I'm trying to understand why you think the check and balance will occur because of the shift in...
It's not a matter of what I think. It's what the Congress decreed from in 1954. 4 at-large, 7 district is constitutional. The at-large representing the geographical area, the territory.
Right.
The district senators were to represent the population. This is constitutional. It's not the St. Croix government retirees' choice.
No,
it's
no.
not Mario's choice. It's in the Constitution of the United States and the Federalist Papers. They're right there.
I'm not disagreeing with you, Mr. Moorhead. I'm trying to make sure that our listening audience understands what they're voting for. That's what we're trying to get across here. Really, that's all this is. Yes, Mr. Moorhead, you wanted, Mr. Abramson, you wanted to respond?
I really have a question.
Okay.
Because my honorable mentor colleague has indicated several times that it's constitutional. Those things are based on methodology. So my question specifically is, what empirical data was gathered and analyzed to justify that this method will be, because in the Virgin Islands, when we put something in place, it lasts for a long time. So what particular empirical data analyses was done to justify and support this particular system of representation for the population, for the Virgin Islands as it exists now? What?
The short answer is the Congress of the United States. They gave us a legislature structured to mimic the federal system. This was not a choice. It's not a scramble for who likes what. It is what the Republican form of government is, and you can read the man that they call the architect of the U.S. Constitution, the fourth President of the United States, James Madison. There it is. It's not my interpretation. You should ask the Congress, why did they think that an at-large senator would represent a geographical area? You should ask them, why do they think that district senators represent population? This is what's written in the Constitution.
Okay.
It's not my choice.
No, I'm understanding what Mr. Moorhead is saying. Could we, before, I have a question that I'd like to move to that has something to do with money. But I would like Mr. Emmanuel to weigh in on the question in terms of the intent and the goal of this initiative. Mr. Moorhead has spoken about the check and balance objective. How do you see the goal of the initiative? What do you see as the goal of the initiative? I'm asking for clarification.
In the recent election, there was a candidate that said playtime is over. With this initiative, paytime is over. In other words, in the past, candidates were more beholden to the people that put money in their campaign than the people in the district, because everybody was running like in a horse race. When you can be identified by, say, 2,000 voters, say a district has 2,000 voters, you can't run and hide anymore. You have to answer to them. In the past, you didn't have to do that because you could pull votes from all of us in Quayo, all of us in Thomas. But right now, you have to focus on a particular district. And that is what will make a difference in terms of accountability. You can hold one senator or two senators accountable much more easily than you can hold 7 senators accountable.
Okay. Yes, Dr. Parr?
Yes. I just wanted to, what Mr. Abramson was saying is really getting straight to the point about how this initiative only changes one thing, which is how we're choosing our representatives. It doesn't change the system, and it keeps our regular unicameral 15-seat system. And I think this is actually what is most confusing to voters right now, because if you read the initiative, that's all it says. All it says is about how we are electing the legislators. Most of the discussion in here and the stated purpose of this initiative is about structure of government, checks and balances, and the like. But none of that can be seen by the voter who reads the initiative. They're going to read it the way that Mr. Abramson said, which is it does not change anything. It changes only how we elect the legislators. All of these other things we're talking about might happen, but we do not know because they're not in the initiative.
Okay. Yes, Mr. Emmanuel?
None of us has a crystal ball. No initiative is a panacea. We can't force people to be more accountable. All we can do is create a structure that more easily facilitates the occurrence or the creation of accountability. And that's all we're saying. Nobody's saying that if you change this system, automatically everybody's going to become more accountable. That's ridiculous. We can't say that. No matter how detailed you make this initiative, nobody can say that. All we are saying, it provides a more likely basis for voters to hold their representatives accountable, and that the representatives can hold each other accountable, because you have more at large now than we have in the current system.
Okay, before we go on, I'd like to ask Dr. Parr, Mr. Moorhead, in fact, everybody, and I'll go down the row. My interpretation of this is that because you don't have a requirement, moving off of your point, Mr. Emmanuel, that you don't have all of the information there. We're going to start with Mr. Moorhead. Isn't it possible to have all of the district senators come from one island? From one, I mean, not district, the at-large senators come from one island? No. It is not.
Let me respond according to my geriatric stature, because we don't seem to be aware that previous to 1966, the government that was in place, specifically the structure of the first branch of government, is precisely what we're talking about. We had partisan politics because of the check and balance. Perhaps we don't comprehend this, we don't read enough. But since 1966, partisan politics got bush. We got a one-party system. And we don't seem to realize that before 1966, when we had check and balance, when we had at-large and district senators, we had partisan politics. Unity Party St. Thomas, Democratic Party St. Croix and St. John. Maybe you're too young to be aware of this. But this is the politics that existed here. It's not an experiment. We're returning to what worked for us.
So you believe that the structure that you're speaking about will bring that?
It's not a belief. It is the actual experience.
Okay.
Partisan politics.
All right, thank you. I appreciate your answering. Dr. Parr, did you have anything to answer to that? I was being provocative. Go ahead.
Well, I'm not sure about your specific question, which was about the...
I was asking about unforeseen consequences,
right.
and
Sure,
not
sure.
putting down the at-large people in the right place on purpose. But go ahead.
That's right. And the as far as the unforeseen consequences, they're unforeseen. We don't know what they are. And my biggest issue is that the voters don't actually know what we're shooting for. Well, what Mr. Emmanuel has talked about, the accountability, that we can see, that I can actually see, because what you're doing is you're breaking up the constituency into smaller parts, which is going to change that level of accountability, the voter accountability. That it does change. What it doesn't bring in is any checks of changes in the checks and balances. But the reality is that people have already started talking about things that would change. Senator Thoreau sent out a message a few weeks ago saying, well, at-large senators are going to need more offices, it's going to cost more, and all of this. And none of that's in there, but these are the type. But this is again an unforeseen change that I, as a voter, would not have thought of, and then other voters would not think of, because again, this is a very focused initiative, and it doesn't mention those things.
Dr. Molina, did you want to say something before?
I had a question about the multi-member voting.
Sure.
And we have gone, and you have spoken about the difficulties with that, and that indeed in some jurisdictions it's outlawed, it's not allowed. We are now going to be moving from 7 multi-members to 2. So we really haven't changed we haven't really changed 2 or 3. So we really haven't addressed that particular flaw. And it's a concern, because you're talking about greater accountability, but still you now have 2 from the same district. The question I would ask is, how have other jurisdictions addressed the matter of multi-member voting? This is for Dr. Parr.
Well, most of them have when they were the jurisdictions that were forced to get rid of the block voting method, what they usually went to was a districting of sorts. And usually we were talking about things like town councils and county commissions and things like that. And so the most common thing is to go to having seats so that you are only electing one person from each area. Something like the U.S. Senate just sits. They actually stagger their elections. You have two from a state, but rather than electing them at the same time, you elect one in a regular standard election, and then 2 or 4 years later, you elect the other one. What has happened in a few places is that they've modified that block voting method to, for example, you could say out of our 7 senators, right, 7 representatives right now, you get 7 votes, but maybe you only get 1. Maybe each voter still only gets one vote. Or there's another modification where you've got your 7 votes, but you can give more than 1 vote to a representative. And both of those things, and all of these modifications, now those modifications are not commonly done. Instead, people go to single districts. That's the most common way. But there are other ways you can deal with these things.
Mr. Moorhead, do you have a response you'd like to share?
I would just like some enlightenment.
Of course.
Dr. Parr speaks to what is tangible and palpable. I would like an example of a structure, governmental structure, that he refers to.
Sure, and now
where else would you find 7 representatives to 1 district?
Okay, now this is the thing where I really think that the conversation is confusing, because we're talking about how to elect our representatives at the exact same time that we're talking about governmental structure. But the places where I read about these things being used is not at a state level, but rather for county commissions and at town level.
Give an example, Dr. Parr.
Right? You want me to pick a specific spot? I don't have one for you right now. There are very few.
Exist, Dr. Parr.
What's that?
It does not exist.
It does not exist. Okay.
That's why you can't give an example.
That's not true, Mr. Moorhead.
Well, give an example.
Mr. Moorhead and Dr. Parr, Claire, that's something that needs to be resolved, and you can't do it here. I was finishing something that I would like you folks to continue to talk about how the business of residency can impact your for the at-large people. So we talked about whether or not there were unforeseen consequences. Are you seeing others? And I'm speaking now to Mr. Emmanuel.
Well, thank you. First of all, I didn't agree with you saying that all of the at-large could come from one district.
That was unkind of me and not fair. I was being facetious. That was not right. I apologize.
Because the initiative specifies how many come from St. Thomas.
Yes. That was not a good thing to do. I do apologize.
Okay, now that we clear that up. No, your question was?
No, I'm asking you if you can think of, with respect to the residency issue, because Irva Denham brought it up before. So I'm asking if you have any concerns or pieces of information that you think would help to make that clearer for the voters in terms of how residency for at-large people should be looked at.
No, because we have one at-large senator now. So we don't need to change the requirements for at-large. The requirements now is that everybody votes on that one person, but that person has to come from St. John. The difference now would be we have 6, right? 3 would have to come from St. Thomas, everybody would vote for them. And 3 would come from St. Croix, everybody has to vote for them. And the St. John district wouldn't have an at-large representative. They would have a district representative right now. That is the difference that I see. I could be wrong.
Okay. Ms. Denham, would you please give me some more information regarding this issue?
Thank you very much. I have to go back to a short piece from an article in the St. Thomas Source from November the 1st regarding specifically the at-large candidacy. This is very short. Under the proposal, the territory would be split into 5 districts, 2 on St. Croix, 2 on St. Thomas, 1 on St. John. There would still be 15 senators. The St. John district would have 1 senator, and each of the St. Thomas and St. Croix districts would have 2 senators. Then 3 senators who reside on St. Croix and 3 who reside on St. Thomas would run at large to be elected by all the voters of the Virgin Islands. So far, I don't have a problem at all here. This would mean 6 senators would be elected at large. The closing line of the article was, only an at-large senator could be chosen to be president of the legislature, which would effectively exclude a St. Johnian from ever being president of the legislature. Not only that, he may not run for that office. So I was wondering whether that provision is going to be included when the initiative passes, if that's going to be added into law, if that was the original intent of this. But when you read stuff like this in the press, I had to tell you I got upset by it.
Well, it creates some confusion.
Absolutely,
in terms
it
of
does.
people trying to understand. Mr. Moorhead, is this something you want to respond to, or should I go on to Mr. Abramson?
Respond to Ms. Denham's query.
Thank you.
Again, that's not a part of the initiative. I don't know what her source for that is. She said the source
The
said
St.
that.
Thomas source, it's in
I
an
don't
article.
know.
Okay.
But as Mr. Emmanuel pointed out, I don't know where the confusion stems from. We have district senators, we have at-large senators.
That's not the problem.
What is the problem?
The statement that was there was that only an at-large senator could be chosen to be president of the
responded
legislature.
to that, Mr. Adam, that is news to me, and I would like to know the source of that.
It's
because
in the
it is
St.
not
Thomas-
an initiative.
St. Thomas source, November the 1st, 2018.
So, and that is one of the reasons why we're having this program. We need to clear up some of these things. If that either means that it is not in the, as you said, it's not in the initiative, and this may be somebody planning ahead or interpreting things without, us moving on.
The initiative is very concise, very cogent, and it's there, and similarly like you wanted to know the qualifications for a district senator and a large senator, as Mr. Emmanuel pointed out, the same as we have now.
So that's one of the things I think people need to hear, what things are staying in place and whether or not there are consequences attached to them that they may or may not be comfortable with. Mr. Abramson, you've been biting at the bit. Please, talk to me.
I have, really. But to answer your question, Dr. Axton, in any system of representation, the first thing you must determine is what is your goal. I think Dr. Parks made a good statement. If the issue is accountability, there is only 3 methodologies, and I want to drive this word home. Systems of representation are based on methodology. Some are based on numbers. We have socioeconomic, we have mixed, we have proportional, we have preference, we have many different things. In the Virgin Islands, and if we want to use experience, as my honorable colleague said, then we need to consider sub-districting in its totality, full sub-districting. No at large, full sub-districting for the entire Virgin Islands. Break it up into districts. If that doesn't consistently work, we can consider municipal government, which we had in place for 200 years. Worked fine. We can go local government, municipalities, townships, assemblies, those kind of issues. That is the only methodologies that will give you accountability. Everything else is pie in the sky. I cannot hold a at-large senator accountable to one thing at all. I am telling you now, the only methodologies that will work are the 3 I mentioned. Full and total sub-districting, municipal government, or local government, where we have Christian Center of our government, Charlotte and Maliga government, as we have had in the past, and has worked very well throughout the territory.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Abramson. You've gotten Mr. Emmanuel to think about something he wants to share.
Yes, I only have a few seconds. I agree with Mr. Abramson, but we need to crawl before we can walk. If the community has enough problem with this minor change, can you imagine what it would take if we move directly to a system that Mr. Abramson is talking about? I agree with that. But why don't we take our time and have incremental steps? And at some point in the future, we will reach there.
Okay, I have a question for everybody, but I'm gonna have to, I've been told I need to ask specific names, so maybe I know that Irva Denham is walking with a whole bag full of documents on the Organic Act and so forth, and Mr. Moorhead has a lot of it in his head, as does Mr. Abramson. But my question is, if you read what happens with the initiative after the election, say it passes, am I incorrect when I read that it says that it cannot be amended, the initiative? So I'm going to start with Irva Denham, then I want to have Mr. Abramson and Mr. Moorhead answer, if you don't mind. Can it be amended from whatever is going forward now? Mr. Emanuel just said we should crawl before we walk, and that this is incremental changes. And there are some acknowledgments or implied acknowledgments that some things might not have been thought out. We don't know where things will go.
Right.
So can it be amended?
Technically, probably not. The legislature could come up with its own proposal, or the legislature could, the governor cannot veto it, but the legislature, by a 2/3 majority, could say no, as far as I can recall from the initiative process. The legislature does have a say, but once it's passed, it's the law. And now it's a matter of how do we make it function. There's going to be an awful lot of new laws going to have to be written in order to make it function. Almost all of Title 18 will have to be rewritten because the forms will all be different. Title 2, certainly that'll be the new change. But at this point, I think only the legislature, after the initiative is voted on, I think only the legislature can say no to it. But it would take a 2/3 majority to do so.
Okay. All right.
The law may not be amended
Abramson.
or adjusted or repealed by the legislature or anybody else for a 3-year period.
Right, but after that.
After the 3-year period, it will take 2/3 majority of the legislature to make any changes to the law. So for 3 years, it's in place.
That's what we have.
Full and untouched.
Okay.
Yeah,
Mr. Moorhead, what's your understanding? Same?
My understanding is the same, but I continue to remind us we are trying to become constitutional.
Okay.
The structure that we are urging, as perhaps it's not been made very clear by the St. Croix government retirees, but it's simply this structure that's in the Constitution. Article 4, Section 4 guarantees a Republican form of government. Maybe it is that we don't understand what a Republican form of government is. And that's the problem there. But this is what we had previous to 1966. We're not reinventing the wheel.
Thank you. Dr. Molnar would like to ask a question.
I would like to ask a question for the group. Since there is so much that is unknown about this, a voter would ask, what really are we voting for? We were voting for a structure, but we really are not sure how it's going to function. Would it not be better to develop in advance the functional differences between your district and your at-large, the residency requirements? All of these issues are big questions, and the question one would have to ask, who is going to be the ones to determine all of these issues? How good are we really at developing ideas like this? Look at the Constitutional Convention. We're still trying to get a constitution passed. Should we not spend time fleshing all of these out so voters know what indeed they're voting for before we actually take the initiative for a vote? And I would ask, I see Mr. Emanuel wanting to respond to this, but I'd like to hear yours, and then I'd like to hear Mr. Abramson's after your comment.
Thank you very much, Doctor. That's an excellent question. In an ideal world, I would agree with you 100%, but this is not an ideal world. And back to Dr. Rax's original question, it is not that the details are going to be changes to the initiative. I look at it this way. An initiative is a basic plan, not an instructional guide. The census experts, the districting experts, the supervisor of election, they are the ones who put the rules in place. What you're telling me is you want us to pass something with all the rules in place. Legislation doesn't work that way. You have a basic plan. When the legislature passes something, the departments have to promulgate rules and regulations to implement it, to operationalize it. You asked me to have all of the operationalized stuff within an initiative. I don't understand that. Why are we making that standard for an initiative when it doesn't exist for most legislation? You don't put all those rules in the general framework. That will happen when all the experts get together. And lastly, if you did that before and the initiative didn't pass, you know how many resources you would have wasted? You see what I'm saying? We need to make sure it passes, then you do it. You don't go to step 3 before you're sure you're going to take step 1.
Mr. Abramson?
I think Dr. Molina answered the question for all of us. I think this leads us to what we really need to do, is get a constitution. That's the issue. All of this discussion we're having is, in my mind, basically for North, because in the essence of having a true structural change, we have constitution. And when I talk about structural change, I mean things like, should the governor, lieutenant governor run as a team? I don't think so. Should we have at-large senators at all? Those kind of flesh issues, if we had a real constitutional convention without any of the negativities that have found their way into the document, we can truly flesh out what the structural change of this government should be, and needs to be. Because we are all on the same page. The government needs structural change. There is no question about that.
Okay. Yes, Mr. Moorhead.
A rhetorical statement. Do we have partisan government in the Virgin Islands? Do we have partisan politics? Or is it a one-party system? The question is being asked over and over, how does it function, referring to the change? The way it did previous to 1966. We had the partisan politics that the Republican form of government produces. We weren't confused. Crucians love being Democrats. St. Jonians love being Democrats. St. Thomians love being the Unity Party. And guess what? There would be 5 Democrats in the legislature, 5 Unity Party in the legislature, and a politician by the name of Brother Hodge, who was a maverick. No party. He would sit in the president's chair. That's check and balance. That's the Republican form of government. It's nothing new. We're not imported something from Mars. It's how we lived here.
Mr. Moorhead, I'm not disagreeing with history, but I think two statements have been made that I would ask that we put in context. One is that we probably don't do much legislation without concept papers and briefings before we bring them forward, and we should, because that's what helps you to figure out how to do the promulgation later. And that's what I think I hear happening here. And Mr. Moorhead, with respect to your remembering what we were doing before, I think part of the things that don't stay with us is that we don't remember that in the 60s, this was a very, 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 very different and much smaller community. So I think that the time change needs to add some things to make sure that we do it right. I have to add my congratulations and commendations to the St. Croix retirees and to everybody involved in this, because nothing in this community comes very, very easy. So we're hoping that if we get this information out, people will understand how to make a decision on March 30th. There's nothing else but this to vote on. That's one of the things we're reminding people. Either you say yes or you say no. Okay, I see Dr. Parr and then Mr. Emmanuel. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted, as a couple of things. One is the you know, as far as the reasons why we wanted to have some of these things written out is that if the end goal is, again, structure, then, as Mr. Davidson said, that's what really needs to be talked about, and that's what Dr. Molinar was getting at. I would be very happy to talk about these issues that Mr. Moorhead is bringing up. They're very interesting, they're very important, and they're very timely, but we don't have a ballot initiative that is addressing those, and I would be much happier debating and discussing those things if we did have a ballot measure that was going to be bringing in the Republican form of government and all of that, but that's not what we have. But the issue of partisanship is actually a big issue. You had asked me before about examples of places where you would be using a block voting method, and I can't give you a single state that does that. And the reason is that if any state did use the block voting method to choose their representatives, then a state such as Texas, which is predominantly Republican, would have 100% Republican representation and no Democratic representation. No partisanship. That's the primary reason why they don't use that, is because one majority, all Republican states would be all Republican, no Democrats in there. Slightly Democrat ones would be all Democrat, and I think that might be the type of thing that he was speaking to.
Okay. Mr. Emanuel?
And the current setup of the legislature represents exactly what he is saying.
Yes, I don't think you've heard people say the goal and the objective are wrong or bad, or I don't think there's any disagreement on that, Mr. Moorhead. I think the questions for voters is what we have before us to vote going to help us to meet enough to this goal? And that's what people seem to be grappling with. That's why we ask people to come and talk about this a little bit. I hear no complaints about the goal. Mr. Abramson and then Mr. Emanuel. You didn't finish. I apologize.
No,
Please speak.
I wanted to say I agree with you that we should keep things simple. And that is why I don't really think it's important right now to start another constitutional convention. If we have enough trouble focusing on one issue,
one initiative,
how are we going to, and then you said something just now. The population and the structure of the population in the 1960s is 180 degrees removed from what the population is going to now. It is going to be almost impossible to get everybody to agree on all these issues. If we can't agree on the initiative alone, all these intelligent and knowledgeable people can't agree on this one issue. How in God's name are we going to agree on an entire constitution? History has shown us 5 times. We haven't been able to do it. Let us take things incrementally, one at a time, work them out, and then we'll get to everything later on.
Mr. Abramson?
I'm sitting here in joy. My colleague, Mr. Emanuel, said we've tried 5 times. Hawaii tried 15 times to have a constitution. Yeah. But I haven't one person, I'm surprised that nobody in the room has spoken about the elephant sitting in the room, which are the numerous federal and judicial issues that will be affected by the passage of this particular proposal. Specifically, Article 14 of the United States Constitution, which is equal protection. On June 5th of 2018, the United States Supreme Court mandated that the law of the land shall be one man, one vote. That is the law of the land right now. With that said, the one man, one vote will be violated by this particular constitution, and that St. John will become a soup. Their votes will be worth 300 times mine. They will have triple representation that I have. Nobody spoken about that. Those federal issues, and I am sure somebody will be headed to court the minute if this is in passage, and that elephant nobody's addressed. And I just wanted to bring to everybody's attention that there are numerous federal and judicial issues that loom to address this particular subject.
Okay, Mr. Moorhead and then Mr. Emanuel.
The Supreme Court, specifically, the very conservative Justice Felix Frankfurter said, districts protect the minority from the tyranny of the majority. Now, why would we want to speculate when the plan is right there? There are 85 Federalist Papers explaining what the Constitution means, such as the Republican form of government, check and balances, districts, it's all there. So I don't know why we're groping as if we're in a dark room here. It's just a matter of reading and comprehending what we read. It is there. Districts protect the minority from the tyranny of the majority.
Okay. Mr. Emmanuel, thank you, Mr. Moorhead.
This is the crux of the matter.
All right.
But as I have said, the population experts, the boundary and district experts have not defined what St. John is going to constitute. We're assuming that it's going to stay the same, just everybody who lives on the island of St. John. That's the assumption that is being made. I do not know that any population expert or any census expert or the board supervisor of the elections will define it in that way. They have to make this initiative constitutional. To say it is unconstitutional now before you don't even know what the boundaries are is presumptuous, it's preposterous. And that is the very reason why it is general, so that the experts can look at the population changes, and we don't have to wait till 2020, because every year there's an intercensal survey that is conducted, as you know, by the University of the Virgin Islands. I have been in charge of it. So we don't have to wait 10 years for the population. So when these experts, Mrs. Fox, Dr. Mills, people in population, they're not going to define a district to make it unconstitutional. They're not going to define a district to violate the one-man vote. So why are we saying these things? Let us wait and see what these people of integrity are going to do. Stop scaring the public. That's all you're doing.
All right. Mr. Abramson?
I have to respond to that. We're not scaring the public. The issue is that these issues are things that we need food for thought. I mean, we just passed a measure in the Virgin Islands for medical marijuana. It can't very well put money in the bank here because it's still against the federal law across the nation. These issues are things that we must consider in making decisions. You can't just be blind to something that is critically important as whether or not a St. Johnian vote is going to be more powerful than mine. That is very important to me as an elector and a voter. I want us to be on all equal footing. It's not an assumption. It is a fact without any empirical data. And I asked the initial question, where is the empirical data that was gathered and analyzed to say that this proposal has value? There is none I have not seen any. And I need, as a technocrat, that kind of information to help me make an informed decision. And and I think a lot of our community should be like that.
Okay. One of the questions that came up before had to do with costs, the cost of running for office. What about the cost of the legislature? Does anybody see that changing? And I'm supposed to ask a specific question, and I should ask Mr. Emmanuel. Yes.
If we did what Mr. Abramson said, right, the legislature size would have to expand exponentially. We'd have to have, I think, 21 seats. What this proposal does is try to keep everything within the 15-member count. And that is why we have all these problems. Because if we had 30 delegates, then St. John would have its own. And he wouldn't even have an issue to that. So the cost would be more if we had a bicameral legislature. We're trying to fit everything into we're doing a hybrid thing. We're trying to support the Republican form of government within the same size of the legislature. Guam has many more members than we do. Puerto Rico has many more members. We have financial constraints. Regardless of which way we go, it's going to cost money. So let's put that down as a realistic fact. Whether we form a bicameral body or we change this one to meet the Republican form of government, it's going to cost money. Right now, we're unconstitutional. Mr. Abramson said, for almost 200 years, we had bicameral bodies. We had, not bicameral bodies, we had district representation on St. John. from back in the Danish times. The only time it has changed is within the last 52 years, 1966. So our history is the empirical evidence that he's talking about, that it worked from back in from 1735 on St. Croix all the way up till 1966. That's the empirical data that we have.
In an
History.
extremely different Virgin Islands.
I agree.
But yes, I agree. It existed and it did work for most people, yes. Yes, Ms. Denham, I'm sorry.
I would just like to ask another question regarding keeping 15 senators without the problem of having to say that St. John is overvoting. What if during the reapportionment it's decided that St. John remains a part of the St. Thomas district and that some of the population, let's say from the east end of St. Thomas, is included with St. John as one district senator? Then the district of St. Thomas, St. John, as I was working on theoretical math, between those two islands, there would be 8 senators, and St. Croix would end up with 7. Was this ever part of or thought about in generating this plan so we don't end up with St. John with, let's say, 2,100 voters suddenly having a seat that's elected by twice and 3 times that many in St. Thomas or St. Croix?
I respond?
Yes, please, Mr. Moore.
Sure.
If you have an answer, we'd like to hear it.
Yes, I do.
Okay, great.
Good.
Ever heard of the Connecticut Compromise? What you're
Going back,
suggesting
yeah.
would have broken up the 1787 convention in Philadelphia because the smaller states demanded the same representation as the larger. Today, the state of Wyoming doesn't even have a large enough population to qualify for 1 member in the House of Representatives. Yet they do, and they're there. And they have 2 senators, even they should merely have 600,000 people. California has 40 million, and the same 2. The Connecticut Compromise.
All right, then it sounds like perhaps there needs to be another piece of legislation or perhaps another test case through the court which says that if we are to think of 3 islands as 3 separate districts, that each district shall have at least 1. I think that's kind of where we're heading and kind of where we were all those years ago. The first time I voted, it was for 11 senators. So I remember those days. And I was a resident of St. John at the time. Yes.
All right. Mr.
Yeah.
Emmanuel and then Dr. Parr.
Very brief. I agree with her, but Article 1 of the Constitution says that for the Congress, that every district is supposed to have 1 representative. The arguments that people are making that, well, this is not a federal body. Hello? The Organic Act is still a federal law.
That's correct.
No local law can authorize our legislature because we're not independent. So let's talk the truth. This body is a federal body. There's no local authorization. And if we authorize something, Section 8 of it says the federal government can annul any law.
Correct.
So why are we not looking at Article 1, the very first article of the Constitution that requires that regardless of population and all of that, everybody, as Ms. Denham said, every district must have at least 1 representative. And to be honest, all these things about mathematical niceties and your vote being diluted is a bunch of nonsense because the Supreme Court case that this thing was based on was where they had so many different people in a country district controlling the votes of thousands in the town. All we have is 1 island on St. John. Like I said before, you're comparing watermelon with juju. It doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense.
Mr. Emmanuel, the things that are coming out in this conversation are the things that our voters need to think about. This is important. I mean, regardless of how you come down on this, people need to think through this stuff. Dr. Parr, you had a point you wanted to make?
Yeah, there were a couple of things that Mr. Manuel said about districts. One is that we were going to leave it up to the experts to draw the districts, but the initiative actually doesn't do that. The initiative sets the districts. It sets St. John as a district, and the only leeway is how you're going to divide the two on St. Croix and the two on St. Thomas. So it doesn't really leave it up. But we had a question about about what reapportionment meant at the beginning of this discussion, and you said it was really about the numbers. What it's really about is how you are dividing those numbers amongst the different constituencies. Every 10 years, the U.S. House of Representatives is reapportioned, and they decide how many representatives each state gets. At that point, if you're California and you just went from 35, and I'm making up numbers here, 35 to 36 representatives, you now draw 36 districts instead of drawing 35 because you now have more representatives. And so in our situation, if we were going to just go by population, we decide how many representatives that we are going to have, and then we figure out how the districts go. And we don't have to leave St. John as a single district. We can decide to do that, but we don't have to do that.
Folks, I knew this was going to happen. Just as we're getting to the good stuff, we're going to have to end. What we want people to do is to continue to look at the initiative, read things, as Mr. Moorhead keeps saying, and everybody else on this group, and make sure that it makes sense to you and you try to get a better understanding of what you're doing when you go to the polls. One of the quick questions I wanted to ask was whether or not anybody had anything to say, and I'm going to ask Mr. Abramson, because you were in a position like this before, what happens the day after it passes, and then what should people expect? Which hole in the ground is going to open?
If the initiative is successful, as has been said, the wheels start in motion. Basically, who needs to do what? And that's the scramble, because the initiative does not speak to responsibility. It's, again, just like others we have done, it's non-binding on any institution. It's not the responsibility of the election system. It could be the responsibility of the legislature. It might be the responsibility of somebody else. We don't know. The scramble starts.
So that means that there will be Mr. Emmanuel is disagreeing with you just by his face, and we can't really discuss it, but that's clearly one of the issues that needs to be cleared up, and somebody needs to write about this somewhere. Dr. Molinar?
Yeah, this has been a really quick 2 hours, and I want to thank our discussants for making this such an interesting and informative conversation. You've demonstrated to the public so well that we can have differences of opinion and treat each other with respect and speak in a most civil manner while doing so.
As we close the program, we want to again thank everyone for listening. Please tell others about the forum, as it will be re-aired on both radio and television. The re-aired dates and times are March 9th at 5 p.m. and March 17th at 1:30 p.m. on channels 12 and 90.
In closing, we reiterate once more that this forum is in keeping with the League's mission and way of implementing mission. We assert that the content of the program is exclusively the domain of the League. Again, we thank all of the participants.
WTJX has provided the setting and the technical staff, and we certainly thank them for this program. And neither the station nor the sponsors have had any influence on this program content or the format. This has all been from the League. And we are indeed grateful for the cooperation of the station and sponsors.
Thank you for watching and for listening. And on March 30th, go out and vote.
The views expressed on this program are not necessarily those of WTJX, its board, staff, or underwriters. This program was underwritten by
Support comes from Seaflight with a fleet of Cessna 208 amphibious aircraft with ACN leather seating. Seaflight provides a complete range of aviation services, 6 round-trip flights from St. Thomas to St. Croix, and charters to all Caribbean islands. For more information, 340-714-3000. Seaflight, in operation since 2007.
and viewers like you.